show you how to do one of our original techniques called the quick cluster.
What is the quick cluster?
The quick cluster is a way to get a cluster of beads using half the number of head pins and no basic wire wrap. It's a very easy technique to do and it's quite fast. It's a nice way to get body and texture and color into a piece without adding a lot of bulk and a lot of like silver wire showing.
Do you need any special tools to do the quick cluster?
You actually need all the basic wire wrap tools. You do need a chain nose plier, round nose plier, flat nose plier, and a wire cutter to do this technique. You do also need ball head pins and lots of beads. Okay, the first thing you want to do before you actually start the technique is to decide, what beads you want to go with each other. So I have a handful of beads here, and I'm going to actually start deciding my pairings of beads because this technique requires that you have 2 sets of beads on each head pin. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at this flower bead that we have here. And in a flat bead like this, sometimes it helps to put something under it to kind of prop it up out of the cluster so it stands out more. And the way you can do that is by stringing another bead like this. So this is what you will see when the technique is completed. Okay? And it'll be a little bit higher because we have this bead under it. Okay, so you're gonna want to prop up your flat beads like this, and I think I'm going to use a pearl for the other side. You can mix sizes and shapes. It actually adds a lot of texture and a very rich look to the piece. So I have a mix of sizes and shapes here, and it's okay if you put big beads with small beads. You just don't want them to be too small, or else the big bead is going to hide the second bead that you're going to put on there. Because I have this pearl under the flower though, I can put it with another sort of small bead and it'll show because the flower is propped up and you'll be able to see it under. Okay, so I like these two together. I think I like these. These are fancy head pins. They have little gems set in the bottom of them. Okay, and I'm going to use this as a bead. So I'm going to maybe pair these together. I just want a mix of shapes and colors. We have bead caps here. These are decorative little silver bead caps. And I'm going to put a little bead in them to kind of fill it up, but you still get that little texture around the side. So you'll get something that looks like this. A lot of bead caps look like little flowers. And that's a very cute look, so I'm going to put this little blue bead inside my bead cap, like that. And I think I'll pair that with a pearl. And I have some decorative silver beads here, and I think I'll string that on a head pin too. So now I have my pairings. And you really don't need to repeat the same pairings over and over if you're going to use this in a repetitive strung piece, because it gives you a random look anyway. So the pairings don't have to be all the same in your clusters. But because I want to replicate it exactly, I'm going to remember which beads I paired together. I'm going to grab the head pin on the upper third of the plier and leave just a little bit of space between the plier jaw and the top of the bead. Then I'm going to pull the wire around the back jaw of the plier. As you're about to hit the bead in the front, you want to pull the wire over and have it rest in that space between the plier jaw and the top of the bead. If it's kind of wobbly and there's a lot of space and your loop looks too big, you can actually roll the plier just a little bit forward And we're going to string on our second bead. And we want to make sure that the bead touches the loop. We're going to make our second loop that will hold this bead in place on the head pin. And again, we're going to grab it with the very tip of the plier because we want a smaller loop on this side. And we're going to still leave a little bit of space. We're going to pull the wire around the back jaw and go over. And you can give it a little roll forward. Your component looks like that. Now I'm ready to cut the extra wire from my component, and I have a very small cutter with a very fine point. This makes it much easier to trim the tail away. I'm going to want to use my flat nose plier to make that ending nice and flush, meaning that there's no extra wire sticking out. The loop opened up a little bit, and sometimes the beads don't feel as tight on the component as they should. You can always tighten it by getting your flat nose plier and giving it a twist, because you want the beads to sit really tight against each other. You don't want any jiggling, because if the beads can move, that means they can slide up and down on the head pin. So when your components are all strung in place, you'll see some wire sticking out below the ball of the pin, and that can snag onto things and break over time. So now let me show you how to do the coily ending. We're going to string our beads, get the round nose plier, pull the tail around the back jaw of the plier and over the beads into the space just made. I personally like this loop to be fairly small. It needs to be big enough so that it can go, you can string things through it, because that's how we're going to attach it to our piece. But you don't want it to be really big, because a big loop is easier to pull open than a small loop. The only time you would want a big loop in this section here is if you're going to do a loose cluster and you're going to be stringing your components on a thick piece of chain or a thicker jump ring. I'm going to adjust my loop just a little by rolling my plier forward. I'm going to string my second bead on. I want to make sure it touches. I'm going to trim to about a 1/2 inch of wire. Then I'm going to grab my round nose plier. I'm going to grab the very tip of the head pin with my round nose plier, and I'm going to just roll forward and make a very tiny coil. An ideal coil would have the loops sitting right next to each other with no spaces in between them. And because we press down on the bead against this loops, it usually wants to open up. So you'll want to twist it shut, just as a matter of practice. Now I'm going to show you what you can do with your quick cluster components. One thing you can do is you can make a link with your components and join them together with pieces of unsoldered chain. So it's like you're making a beaded bead. So we're going to start with some 22 gauge half hard wire. It's a nice sturdy gauge of wire to use. And I did a basic wire wrapped loop on one side already. And I made about a 3.5 millimeter inner diameter loop. And I started with about 3 inches of wire. So what we're going to do is, it helps to kind of think of your cluster components as a sandwich. And you need bread for your sandwich, and you need some fillings. Okay. The components that we made are going to be the fillings of the sandwich. And we're going to need a couple of pieces of bread to hold them in place. So in this case, I'm going to use about a 6 millimeter silver saucer shaped bead, but you can use, you know, something a little bit bigger. It can't be really tiny because it has to hold all your fillings in place. Okay, so you can use crystals, or you can use like another freshwater pearl if you want it to look very beady. So you need to string on one side of your bread, and then we're going to put in the fillings. So you really need to remember, you want to string through the loop that sits between the two sets of beads. Okay, you want to string through the middle loop, not this end one over here, because it's going to stick out a lot. You want to go through the loop in the middle of the two beads. Okay, and we're going to string on our component. You can kind of shake them so that they settle in against each other, kind of like Lincoln logs. Then we're going to string on our second piece of bread. Thus, and you don't want like a really big gap in between the two. You want all of the components to sit together as tight as possible. Okay, so you can sort of swivel them this way and that until you get the tightest possible fit, like this. And then, to hold everything together, you can do a basic wire wrap on the other side to complete your link. Okay, now I have all of my quick cluster components strung on my 22 gauge wire, and now I'm going to basic wire wrap it to finish it off as a link.
Basic wire wrap is such a fun technique. When you can do that, you can do anything.
And now I have my finished link. Another thing you can do with your quick cluster components is to straight string them. And what we like to do is, because each cluster takes up so many beads, and you know you don't want to have an excessive amount of beads on your piece, we intersperse clusters with larger beads. Okay. So I'm going to alternate my clustered components with freshwater pearls. These are about 9 millimeter semi-round kind of oval shaped pearls. I still want to sandwich the components between a smaller kind of bead, so again I'm going to use these 6 millimeter saucer shaped beads. And again, you want to string through the loop that sits between the two beads.
Is there a reason why you like saucer-shaped beads to be the bread on the ends?
I kind of like them to be, you know, sort of shorter in profile so it sits recessed in the cluster. But you can use a long bead or a round bead and it will hold in your components just the same way.
Would it work if you used a really just big round bead?
It'd be hard to get the big round bead to sit really tight against the cluster because they have height to them and you really want to push them together. So a big bead won't be as effective pushing them together as a smaller one. So let's see what this looks like after I string my second set. And you don't have to string the clusters in the same order every time because it'll give you a nicer random look if you don't. But I do like to put the components with the biggest beads sort of in the middle of the cluster and not hanging off the end. But that's just personal preference. Okay.
It looks really pretty from here.
I like these colors. So if you were to repeat until you have a bracelet length, when you shake everything together, and again, you do want to shake all the gaps out of your piece, you'll get something that looks like that. This is my bead stopper. It keeps the beads from falling off of my beading cable. It's quite awesome. Another thing you can do with our quick cluster components is to make a kind of a loose clustered effect by stringing your components on either an open jump ring or an unsoldered piece of chain. If you're going to do this style, I highly suggest you make the loops that sit in between the two beads larger than you would if you were going to just string it on a head pin or string it on some beading cable, because you want a little bit more movement allowed in your piece. So if you make the larger loops, they will be able to move more freely. Okay. This is about a 4mm diameter loop that I made closer to the base of the round-nosed Lindstrom plier. So what you're going to do is we're going to get our unsoldered piece of chain and we're just going to string right through the big loop in the middle. Of the two beads. Like that. Okay, and then we're going to hook it on to our closed ring here. And we want to make sure that this unsoldered chain is closed nice and tight so we don't lose any components. I'm going to get my chain nose plier and my flat nose and I'm going to swivel it shut. And you have your loose cluster.
Wow, that's really pretty, and it's done without any basic wire wrapping.
It's done without any basic wire wrap. And the beads will fall just the way they want because they're not stuck in place on your piece. The final thing we can do with our quick cluster components is to string it as part of a basic wire wrap component. Okay. So I have a fancy head pin here that I strung a nice big pearl and a bead cap. And now instead of putting a smaller bead as the sandwich for my bread, I'm going to use the pearl and the cap as the bottom of my cluster. I'm going to string my components onto my head pin so that they sit right on top of my pearl. Now you can use anywhere from 2 components minimum to as many as 5 or even 10 components if you want a very large cluster. A nice average though is between 4 and 6. So you get a nice full cluster, but it's not, you know, overwhelming. Okay, again, we're going to want to shake our piece so that all the beads settle down nice and tight against each other. I still need my top piece of bread to complete my sandwich. Okay, now they're sitting nice and tight against each other, and I'm going to do my basic wire wrap to complete my component. And when you do your basic wire wrap, you want to make sure that the chain nose pliers sits really tight on top of the beads so it holds everything together.
Michelle, how do you begin to even pick the beads that go on a quick cluster?
Oh, let's see. When I pick my beads for the quick cluster, I usually like to start off with beads that are between 4 and 6 millimeter in size because they're a nice starting point. And then I'll pick little accent beads like 3 millimeter, but I'll always plan to stack them within something bigger. And sometimes if you want like a really showy piece, then you can pick maybe 1 or 2 larger focals. I like to pick anywhere between 6 to 8 beads to begin with and just see how it looks, and then I'll add things from there. It's really fun. It's nice. You can use little odds and ends of beads too if you want your clusters to look really crazy and wild and different. You can use just a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and because it gives you that really mixed up look like that, you know, you can't tell that the ingredients for each cluster is different. So before I totally coil it really tight, I'm going to just twist the beads a little bit more and then wrap it shut.
That is a very pretty bracelet you have on.
Thank you. It is a quick cluster done with all different sizes and shapes of Swarovski crystal.
Is that straight strung?
It is straight strung. The bigger beads that I used are the 12 millimeter gem cut and our little thin daisy spacers.
Wow.
Okay. So here is my completed component. It's nice because you can sort of, even though it's wrapped completely, you can still sort of swivel things around and sort of smoosh things around and rearrange it just a little just to get the look that you want.
That would be really cute as a pendant.
Mm-hmm.
Or earrings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle, what is the hardest part about doing the quick cluster?
I think for everyone, the hardest part is choosing the beads, at least for their first one. So if you have any questions or if you need any help picking colors, you can always come down or shoot us an email, and we'll be happy to put either a kit together for you or just help you pick out some colors that would work together really nicely.
Thanks.
Hope you have fun.